We are not meant to leave Earth. Every cell in your body knows this. Every heartbeat, every breath, every electrical impulse in your brain is calibrated for this one world, this pale blue dot spinning through the cosmos. 4 billion years of evolution have shaped us for Earth and Earth alone. We are not visitors here. We are expressions of this planet, as much a part of it as the oceans and the mountains and the air itself. And yet we dream of living elsewhere. I have spent my life encouraging that dream. I have spoken of humanity spreading across the solar system, of cities on Mars, of generations born beneath alien skies. I believe in that future. I believe it is necessary. But tonight I want to tell you something that dreamers often forget. The universe does not want us. It is not hostile in the way a predator is hostile. It is simply indifferent. And that indifference may be impossible to overcome. When we talk about humans living on another planet, we are not talking about a longer camping trip. We are not talking about astronauts enduring hardship for a few years before returning home. We are talking about permanent habitation, babies born on alien worlds, children who have never seen Earth's blue sky, generations living and dying without ever feeling rain on their faces or hearing the sound of wind through trees. This is a fundamentally different challenge than anything our species has attempted. And the more I learn about biology, about physics, about the delicate interdependencies that make life possible, the more I wonder whether we are attempting something that cannot be done. Let me explain why. The first thing you must understand is that you are not an individual organism. You are an ecosystem, a walking, talking collection of trillions of living things, all of them dependent on conditions that exist only on Earth. Your body contains approximately 37 trillion human cells, but it also contains roughly 38 trillion bacterial cells, mostly in your gut. These bacteria are not parasites. They are partners. They help you digest food, synthesize vitamins, regulate your immune system, and even influence your mood and behavior. Without them, you would die. This bacterial community, your microbiome, evolved alongside humanity for millions of years. It is adapted to Earth. It expects Earth's foods, Earth's temperatures, Earth's daily rhythms. What happens to this delicate ecosystem when you remove it from the only environment it has ever known? We have some data from astronauts on the International Space Station. The results are concerning. Gut bacteria change in space. Some beneficial species decline. Some potentially harmful species increase. The balance shifts in ways we don't fully understand. Astronauts return to Earth after 6 months with altered microbiomes that take months to recover. Now imagine a lifetime in space. Imagine generations. The microbiome that your children inherit will not be the same one you brought from Earth. It will have adapted to spacecraft conditions, to processed food, to recycled air and water. Will that adapted microbiome still serve human needs? Will it still synthesize the vitamins we require? Will it still regulate our immune systems properly? We don't know. We can't know until we try. And trying means experimenting on human beings, on children, on generations who cannot consent to the experiment. But the microbiome is just the beginning. Let me tell you about gravity. You don't think about gravity. It's simply there, a constant presence you've never been without. But your body thinks about gravity constantly. Every system in your body is calibrated for Earth's gravitational pull. Your heart pumps blood upward against gravity. Your bones maintain density to support your weight. Your muscles develop strength to move your mass. Your inner ear orients you in three-dimensional space using gravity as the reference. Remove gravity, and all of these systems begin to malfunction. In microgravity, blood no longer pools in your legs. It rises toward your head, increasing pressure in your skull and your eyes. Your heart, no longer working against gravity, begins to shrink and weaken. Your bones, no longer bearing weight, lose calcium at alarming rates. Your muscles, no longer fighting to keep you upright, atrophy and weaken. Your inner ear, deprived of its primary reference, sends confused signals that cause nausea and disorientation. We have studied these effects extensively on the International Space Station. Astronauts exercise 2 hours every day to combat them. Even so, they return to Earth weakened, requiring weeks of rehabilitation. And they were only in space for 6 months. Now consider Mars. Mars has gravity, but only 38% of Earth's. Is that enough? Enough for what? Enough to maintain bone density? Enough to keep your heart strong? Enough to let your inner ear function properly? Enough for a developing fetus to form correctly? We have no idea. We have never kept a human being in partial gravity for an extended period. We have data on microgravity and we have data on Earth gravity. We have nothing in between. The entire range from 0 to 1g is a mystery. Some optimists assume that any gravity is better than none, that Mars's 38% will be sufficient to prevent the worst effects of weightlessness. Perhaps they're right, but they're guessing. They're making assumptions about human physiology based on no data whatsoever. What if 38% is not enough? What if you need at least 50% of Earth's gravity to maintain bone density? What if you need 70% for proper cardiac function? What if you need full Earth gravity for a fetus to develop normally? If any of these thresholds exist, Mars colonization becomes impossible. Not difficult, impossible. You cannot change the gravity of a planet. You cannot engineer your way around fundamental physics. If human bodies require Earth-level gravity to function, then humans cannot live permanently on Mars or any other world in our solar system. And the Moon is worse. The Moon has only 17% of Earth's gravity. If Mars is questionable, the Moon is almost certainly inadequate. The bodies of lunar colonists would deteriorate continuously, generation after generation, each cohort weaker than the last. This is not a problem we can solve with exercise equipment. Exercise helps in microgravity, but it doesn't eliminate the damage. It slows the decline. Over a lifetime, that decline continues. Over generations, it accumulates. What would the 10th generation of lunar colonists look like? Would they be recognizably human? Would their bones be strong enough to stand in Earth gravity? Would their hearts be able to pump blood to their brains if they ever visited the world of their ancestors? These questions haunt me because we don't have answers. We only have assumptions. And assumptions are not science. Let me tell you about another assumption that may be fatally wrong. The assumption that we can create closed ecosystems that sustain human life. On Earth, you don't think about where your oxygen comes from. You don't think about where your carbon dioxide goes. You don't think about the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the complex web of biological and geological processes that keep our atmosphere breathable and our water drinkable. But on another planet, you must think about all of these things, because they will not happen automatically. You must make them happen. You must engineer an artificial ecosystem that does everything Earth's biosphere does naturally. We have tried this multiple times. The results have been sobering. Biosphere 2 was the most ambitious attempt. Built in Arizona in the early 1990 seconds, it was a 3-acre enclosed structure containing miniature versions of Earth's biomes: rainforest, ocean, desert, savanna. 8 people sealed themselves inside for 2 years, intending to survive entirely on the ecosystem they had created. They nearly died. Oxygen levels dropped dangerously low, falling from 21% to 14%, equivalent to an altitude of over 4,000 meters. Carbon dioxide fluctuated wildly. Crops failed. Most of the animal species went extinct. The colonists lost weight and suffered from chronic hunger. They divided into factions and fought bitterly. The experiment had to be rescued. Fresh oxygen was pumped in from outside. Food was smuggled in. The sealed system could not sustain 8 people for 2 years. This was on Earth, with Earth's sunlight, with Earth's gravity, with the ability to open a door and walk outside if things got truly desperate. Imagine attempting this on Mars, with 43% of Earth's sunlight, with 38% of Earth's gravity, with no possibility of rescue if things go wrong. We learn important lessons from Biosphere 2. We learned that ecosystems are more complex than we imagined. We learned that unexpected interactions can doom the entire system. We learned that maintaining atmospheric balance is extraordinarily difficult. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. We still don't fully understand why Biosphere 2 failed. We know oxygen was lost, but the exact mechanism is still debated. We know the ecosystem became unstable, but we can't fully explain the cascade of failures. How can we build a working, closed ecosystem on Mars when we don't understand why our best attempt failed on Earth? The answer, I fear, is that we can't. Not with our current knowledge, not with our current technology. We can build life support systems that work for months or years, consuming stored resources and gradually degrading. We cannot build self-sustaining ecosystems that work for generations, and without self-sustaining ecosystems, permanent colonization is impossible. You cannot ship oxygen from Earth to Mars forever. You cannot send food shipments across interplanetary distances for centuries. At some point, the colony must become self-sufficient or it will die. Let me tell you about children, because this is where the dream of colonization confronts its most fundamental challenge. Visiting another planet is one thing. Adults can accept risks, they can endure hardship, they can sacrifice their health and even their lives for a cause they believe in. But colonization requires children. It requires pregnancy and birth and development in an environment that no human child has ever experienced. Without children, there is no colony. There is only a temporary outpost waiting to die with its founders. We have never conceived a human being in space. We have never gestated a human being in anything other than Earth gravity. We have never raised a child in the radiation environment of deep space or another planet. We have absolutely no data on whether any of these things are possible. We are not filling in gaps in our knowledge. We are facing a complete void. What we do have is animal studies, and the results are not encouraging. Experiments with rodents in microgravity showed developmental abnormalities that should terrify anyone planning human reproduction off Earth. Bones don't form correctly. The skeletal system, deprived of gravitational stress during critical developmental windows, produces structures that are weaker and malformed. Muscles don't develop properly. The muscular system, which expects to work against gravity from the moment of first movement, atrophies before it has fully formed. The vestibular system, which controls balance and spatial orientation, becomes fundamentally confused. Animals conceived and raised in microgravity cannot orient themselves properly when returned to normal gravity. They stumble, they fall, they cannot tell up from down. Their brains wired themselves for an environment without gravitational reference, and they cannot rewire for Earth. Studies on pregnant rats flown on space shuttle missions showed that their offspring had altered development of the inner ear structures responsible for balance. The changes were permanent. The animals never adapted to normal gravity, even after months of exposure. They were, in a very real sense, disabled by their birth environment. Now, rodents are not humans. Their development is faster, their physiology different, their brains less complex. Perhaps human fetuses would adapt better. Perhaps the human developmental program is robust enough to handle non-Earth conditions. Perhaps our greater neuroplasticity would allow children to adjust in ways that rodents cannot. But perhaps not. The human brain is the most complex object in the known universe. 100 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others, forming a network of perhaps 100 trillion synapses. Its development depends on an intricate sequence of events timed precisely over 9 months of gestation and years of childhood growth. Neurons migrate to specific locations guided by chemical signals. Synapses form in particular patterns based on neural activity. The brain literally wires itself in response to environmental inputs, creating the structures that will define a person's capabilities for life. What inputs does a developing brain expect? Gravity, constant gravity, providing a reference frame for spatial development. The vestibular system begins functioning in the womb, sensing the mother's movements, establishing the neural foundations for balance and coordination, a 24-hour day-night cycle, setting circadian rhythms that will regulate sleep, hormone production, and countless other functions throughout life. A specific range of temperatures, pressures, sounds, and sensations that tell the developing brain what kind of world it's preparing for. The developing brain expects Earth because the developing brain evolved on Earth. 4 billion years of evolution have optimized human development for exactly one set of environmental conditions. We are not generalists capable of developing anywhere. We are specialists, exquisitely calibrated for our home world. Change those inputs, and you change the brain that forms. This is not speculation. This is basic developmental neuroscience. The brain that develops in response to Mars gravity, Mars day length, Mars radiation, and Mars sensory environment will be different from a brain that develops on Earth. The question is not whether the brains will differ. The question is how much they will differ, and whether those differences will be compatible with healthy function. Perhaps the changes would be minor. Perhaps children born on Mars would be perfectly healthy, differing from Earth-born children in trivial ways. They might have slightly different balance, slightly different spatial processing, slightly different circadian rhythms. Interesting for scientists, but not problematic for the children themselves. Or perhaps the changes would be profound. Perhaps Mars-born children would suffer neurological problems we cannot predict, cognitive deficits that make learning difficult, sensory processing disorders that distort their perception of reality, motor control problems that make physical tasks challenging, mental illnesses with no earthly equivalent, arising from brain structures that formed in conditions evolution never anticipated. We don't know. We can't know until we try. And trying means experimenting on children who cannot consent, who will bear the consequences of our ignorance for their entire lives, who may suffer in ways we never imagined because we were too eager to become a multi-planet species. I find this ethically troubling in ways that I cannot resolve. We accept some experimentation on children when the benefits clearly outweigh the risks. We vaccinate children against diseases even though vaccines carry small risks, because the diseases carry much larger risks. The calculus is clear. But colonization is different. The risks to children born off Earth are unknown, but potentially enormous. The benefits to those specific children are unclear. They didn't choose to be pioneers. They didn't volunteer for an experiment. They were simply born, as all children are born, without any say in the circumstances of their birth. Is it ethical to create children under conditions of such profound uncertainty? Is it acceptable to make them subjects of an experiment in human development that could leave them disabled, suffering, or dead? I don't have an answer. But I believe the question deserves more attention than it has received. There's another issue regarding children that colonization advocates rarely discuss. The issue of genetic diversity. A viable population requires genetic diversity. This is not optional. This is not a nice-to-have feature that can be sacrificed for other priorities. This is a fundamental requirement for long-term survival. Inbreeding depression, the accumulation of harmful recessive traits when closely related individuals reproduce, has doomed countless small populations throughout biological history. Every human carries a collection of harmful recessive mutations. We all have them. In a large population, these mutations rarely cause problems because the chance of two people with the same harmful recessive mutation having children together is low. The harmful genes remain hidden, diluted by the genetic diversity of the population. In a small population, the math changes. Everyone is related to everyone else within a few generations. The chance of two people with the same harmful recessive mutation having children together increases dramatically. Those hidden harmful genes become expressed. Genetic diseases that are rare in large populations become common. We see this in isolated human populations throughout history. Island populations, mountain communities, religious groups that married only within the faith. After a few generations of limited genetic mixing, These populations show elevated rates of genetic diseases, reduced fertility, increased infant mortality, the signature of inbreeding depression. How many people constitute a minimum viable population? Estimates vary depending on assumptions about mutation rates, generation time, and acceptable levels of genetic diversity loss. Conservative estimates suggest at least 10,000 individuals for long-term genetic health. More optimistic estimates suggest perhaps 500 could be sufficient with careful genetic management. Now imagine a Mars colony. Transporting humans to Mars is extraordinarily expensive and difficult. Even the most optimistic projections don't envision thousands of colonists arriving in the early decades. We're talking about initial populations of perhaps a dozen people growing to perhaps 100 over years or decades, reaching perhaps 1,000 only after massive sustained investment spanning generations. These numbers are well below the minimum viable population threshold. Any Mars colony would face genetic bottleneck from its founding. Every generation would be more inbred than the last. The genetic diversity that colonists brought from Earth would erode steadily, with no way to replenish it except through continued immigration from Earth. How do you maintain genetic diversity in a population that small? The options are all problematic. Arranged marriages, matching people based on genetic compatibility rather than personal choice. This maintains genetic diversity but sacrifices reproductive freedom, one of the most fundamental human rights. Are we prepared to create a society where computers decide who can have children with whom? Genetic screening and selective breeding, preventing people with high genetic risk from reproducing. This prevents expression of harmful genes but creates a eugenic society with all the dark historical associations that implies. Who decides which genes are harmful enough to prevent reproduction? Who bears the social stigma of being genetically unfit? Artificial reproduction technologies using sperm and egg banks from Earth to introduce genetic diversity without requiring actual immigrants. This maintains genetic diversity but breaks the link between parents and children. Children would be raised by people who are not their biological parents. Family structures would be fundamentally different from anything in human history. Mandatory breeding programs requiring people to have children whether they want to or not to maintain population levels and genetic diversity. This maintains the colony but transforms it into something resembling a human breeding facility where reproduction is a duty rather than a choice. Each of these options raises profound ethical questions. Each represents a society fundamentally different from any we have known, with restrictions on personal freedom that most people would find intolerable. Yet without some form of genetic management, small colonies are doomed to genetic collapse. Or we could accept genetic decline as the price of colonization, except that each generation will be slightly less healthy than the last, except that the colonists' descendants will be increasingly inbred, increasingly prone to genetic diseases, perhaps eventually unable to reproduce at all. The colony would have a finite lifespan, measured not in years but in generations. Neither option is appealing. Neither option has been honestly discussed by colonization advocates who paint pictures of thriving Martian cities without mentioning the genetic arithmetic that makes such cities problematic. Let me tell you about radiation now. Because radiation affects children even more severely than adults. I've discussed radiation before in the context of space travel, but living permanently on another planet means exposure for a lifetime, for multiple lifetimes, for all the generations yet to come. The mathematics of radiation exposure change dramatically when you're not talking about a 3-year mission, but about permanent habitation spanning centuries. Mars has no global magnetic field. It lost its field billions of years ago when its iron core cooled and solidified. Earth's magnetic field deflects most charged particles from the sun and from deep space, channeling them toward the poles where they create beautiful auroras but do little harm. Mars has no such protection. The thin Martian atmosphere provides some shielding, absorbing, and scattering incoming radiation. It's equivalent to perhaps 15 centimeters of water, which reduces the radiation dose but doesn't eliminate it. On the Martian surface, you would receive radiation exposure, comparable to getting a chest X-ray every few days. Not a lethal dose, not enough to cause immediate harm, but relentless, continuous, accumulating over a lifetime. For adults, this increases cancer risk significantly. Studies of populations exposed to elevated radiation on Earth suggest cancer rates might increase by several % over a lifetime. Significant, but perhaps acceptable for adults who understand the risks and choose to accept them. But children are different. Developing bodies are more sensitive to radiation than adult bodies. Cells that are dividing rapidly, as they do during growth, are more vulnerable to radiation damage. The same dose that causes modest harm to an adult can cause severe harm to a child. More concerning still is the effect on reproduction. Radiation damages DNA. Some of that damage occurs in germ cells, the cells that produce eggs and sperm. Damaged DNA in germ cells can be passed to offspring, creating genetic problems that cascade through generations. We have seen this in studies of populations exposed to radiation. The children of exposed parents have elevated rates of genetic abnormalities. The grandchildren show effects as well. Radiation damage echoes through generations, a toxic legacy that grows rather than diminishes over time. On Mars, every generation would accumulate radiation damage. Every generation would pass some of that damage to their children. The genetic load would increase with each generation born on the planet. After enough generations, the accumulated damage might render the population unable to reproduce. Underground habitats might solve this problem. If colonists lived deep beneath the Martian surface, they would be shielded from most radiation by meters of rock and soil. The radiation dose could be reduced to near-Earth levels. But underground living creates its own problems. No natural light, no windows, no view of the sky or the landscape. Humans have deep psychological needs for sunlight, for connection to the natural world, for open spaces and distant horizons. We evolved under open skies. Our psychology expects sunlight and nature in ways we don't fully understand. Depression rates are higher in environments without natural light. Seasonal affective disorder demonstrates how profoundly sunlight influences mood and mental health. Chronic vitamin D deficiency affects not just bones, but immune function, cognitive performance, and emotional regulation. These effects appear in people who merely spend too much time indoors on Earth, where they can step outside whenever they choose. Imagine never stepping outside. Imagine raising children who have never seen an unfiltered sky. Imagine generations growing up in artificial light, in enclosed spaces, in tunnels and caverns. What would that do to human psychology? What would that do to human development? We don't know. Another experiment we would be conducting on people who cannot consent, another roll of the dice with human lives as stakes. Now let me tell you about something that colonization enthusiasts never want to discuss honestly. The question of self-sufficiency. Because without self-sufficiency, there is no colony. There is only a very expensive, very distant outpost that dies the moment Earth stops sending supplies. On Earth, you don't think about where things come from. You flip a switch and there's light. You turn a tap and there's water. You go to a store and there's food, clothing, medicine, tools, electronics, everything you need to live. Behind that simplicity lies an industrial civilization of staggering complexity, built over centuries by billions of people, involving supply chains that span the globe. Consider something as simple as a pencil. The wood comes from trees grown in managed forests, harvested by specialized equipment, transported by trucks and trains and ships to processing facilities. The graphite comes from mines in China or Brazil, refined through chemical processes, mixed with clay in precise ratios. The metal ferrule comes from brass made by combining copper and zinc from different mines on different continents. The rubber eraser involves latex from tropical trees processed with sulfur and other chemicals. The yellow paint involves pigments and binders from yet more sources. A pencil requires the coordinated activity of thousands of people across dozens of countries, none of whom know each other, none of whom set out to make pencils, all of them participating in a global economic system that converts raw materials into finished products through countless intermediate steps. Now imagine making a pencil on Mars. From scratch, with no supply chain, with no global economy, with perhaps 100 people and whatever equipment you brought from Earth. You can't. The task is absurd. You don't have forests. You don't have graphite mines. You don't have brass foundries or rubber plantations or chemical refineries. You don't have any of the prerequisites for making something as simple as a pencil. This is the fundamental problem of colonization. Modern humans don't survive as individuals or small groups. We survive as a civilization. We depend on a division of labor so extensive that no single person understands more than a tiny fraction of it. We stand on the shoulders of billions, living and dead, whose accumulated knowledge and infrastructure make our lives possible. A Mars colony would have to rebuild civilization from scratch, not just survive, but manufacture everything needed for survival. Every tool, every machine, every component of every system that keeps colonists alive. Let me give you a sense of what this actually requires. A colony needs air. Oxygen must be extracted from Martian resources, either from water ice through electrolysis or from the carbon dioxide atmosphere through chemical processing. This requires equipment, electrolyzers, compressors, storage tanks, pipes, valves, seals, filters, sensors, control systems. Each of these components must be manufactured or brought from Earth. The electrolyzers require membranes made of specialized polymers. The compressors require precision machined metal parts. The seals require elastomers that remain flexible in extreme cold. The sensors require semiconductors fabricated in clean rooms with equipment costing billions of dollars. The control systems require computers, which require microprocessors, which require semiconductor fabrication capabilities that exist in only a handful of places on Earth. How does a colony of 100 people, or 1,000 people, or even 10,000 people manufacture semiconductor chips? They don't. They can't. The knowledge, the equipment, the supply chains required to produce a modern microprocessor are beyond the reach of any small, isolated community. So the colony imports chips from Earth, but chips wear out. Radiation damages them. Cosmic rays cause bit flips and gradual degradation. How many spare chips do you bring? How long do they last? What happens when you run out? The same logic applies to virtually every advanced technology the colony needs. Medicine. You can't manufacture modern pharmaceuticals without chemical synthesis capabilities, quality control equipment, sterile production facilities, and detailed knowledge of biochemistry and pharmacology. A colony might manage basic antibiotics after years of development. Complex medications for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, mental illness, impossible for generations, if ever. Electronics. Beyond simple circuits, electronic manufacturing requires capabilities that took Earth decades to develop and costs hundreds of billions of dollars to maintain. A colony might eventually produce basic electronic components, computer chips, displays, sensors at modern levels of sophistication, not for centuries. Metallurgy. Mars has iron, certainly. Extracting it from ore, refining it, alloying it with other metals to produce steel with specific properties. All of this requires furnaces, chemical processes, testing equipment, expertise. A colony might eventually produce crude iron tools, precision components for machines, medical instruments, electronics, not without capabilities far beyond what any small population can develop. The bootstrapping problem is inescapable. You need advanced technology to survive on Mars. Advanced technology requires industrial civilization to produce. Industrial civilization requires millions of people and vast infrastructure. But you can't transport millions of people to Mars until you have the infrastructure to support them. And you can't build the infrastructure without the people. Some suggest that automation and artificial intelligence could solve this problem. Send robots first. Let them build the factories and habitats and industrial facilities. Then send humans to a world already prepared for them. This is a lovely vision. It's also fantasy, at least with current or foreseeable technology. Modern robots are impressive for specific tasks. They can weld car frames on assembly lines. They can vacuum floors. They can land on Mars and drive around taking photographs. But they cannot do the 1,000 different tasks required to build and maintain industrial infrastructure. They cannot improvise when unexpected problems arise. They cannot repair themselves when they break down. They cannot adapt to situations their programmers never anticipated. Artificial intelligence is advancing rapidly, but we are nowhere close to general-purpose AI that can match human flexibility and problem solving. Current AI systems are narrow, trained for specific tasks, helpless outside their training domains. An AI that can beat world champions at chess cannot make a sandwich. An AI that can generate human-like text cannot turn a wrench. Perhaps in 50 years, perhaps in 100, perhaps never. The assumption that AI will solve the colonization problem is not a plan, it's a hope. And hope is not a strategy for keeping people alive. Let me tell you about what happens when technology fails. Because technology will fail. On Earth, when a critical system fails, you call a repair person, or you buy a replacement, or you work around the problem using alternative systems. The redundancy of civilization cushions you against any single point of failure. On Mars, there is no redundancy. Every system is critical. Every failure is potentially fatal. And every repair must be accomplished with whatever tools and parts and knowledge exist within the colony. Consider the life support system. It provides oxygen, removes carbon dioxide, maintains pressure, regulates temperature and humidity. If it fails completely, everyone dies within hours. If it fails partially, you have days or weeks to fix it before the air becomes unbreathable. What components might fail? Pumps, motors, seals, filters, sensors, control software, heat exchangers, chemical reactors. Dozens of components, each essential, each with a finite lifespan, each subject to wear and damage and malfunction. You bring spare parts, of course, as many as you can afford to transport. But you can't bring infinite spares. You can't anticipate every possible failure. At some point, something will break that you don't have a replacement for. Then what? You improvise, you cannibalize other systems, you manufacture a replacement if you possibly can, you pray that your jury-rigged solution holds together long enough to get more parts from Earth. But Earth is months away at best, years away at worst. A lot of people can die while waiting for a supply ship. This is not speculation. This is the reality of operating in remote, hostile environments. Antarctic research stations have been abandoned because of equipment failures. Ships have been lost at sea when critical systems failed. And these were environments where rescue was possible, where the outside air was breathable, where humans could survive for days or weeks without technological support. Mars offers no such margins. The outside air is not breathable. The temperatures are lethal. The pressure is lethal. Technology is not a convenience on Mars. It is the only thing between you and death. Now multiply this across every system the colony requires. Power generation, water extraction and purification, food production, waste processing, communication, transportation, medical care. Each system complex, each system critical, each system prone to failures that cannot always be predicted or prevented. The reliability requirements are staggering. On Earth, we accept that machines break down, we build in redundancy, we maintain repair capabilities, we accept some downtime as the cost of doing business. On Mars, downtime kills. Systems must work continuously, reliably, for years and decades, maintained by people who cannot call for help, who cannot order replacement parts with next-day delivery, who must solve every problem themselves or die. I am not saying this is impossible. Human beings have survived in hostile environments before. We have lived in deserts where water is scarce, in Arctic regions where cold is lethal, in jungles where disease lurks in every shadow. We are adaptable, we are ingenious, we are stubborn, but we have never attempted anything like Mars. The hostile environments of Earth offered challenges, but they also offered resources. Water in the Arctic, game in the desert, edible plants in the jungle, breathable air everywhere. Mars offers nothing but rock and dust and a thin, poisonous atmosphere. Every resource must be extracted through technological processes. Every necessity of life must be manufactured from hostile raw materials. This is a qualitatively different challenge. It is not merely survival in a harsh environment. It is the creation of an entirely artificial biosphere, an engineered world within the natural world, maintained indefinitely against the relentless pressure of entropy and failure. Let me tell you about food, because food illustrates the challenge better than almost anything else. On Earth, food comes from ecosystems. Soil, bacteria fix nitrogen, plants capture sunlight and carbon dioxide, animals eat plants, decomposers break down waste and return nutrients to the soil. This cycle has operated for billions of years without human intervention. We tap into it, we modify it, we optimize it for our purposes, but we don't create it from scratch. On Mars, you must create it from scratch. There is no soil, there are no bacteria, there are no plants or animals or decomposers. There is only rock and dust and toxic perchlorates. If you want to eat, you must build an entire food production system from nothing. The obvious approach is hydroponics. Grow plants in nutrient solutions without soil. This works on Earth in controlled environments, with nutrients supplied from industrial chemical production, with water from municipal systems, with energy from electrical grids. On Mars, you must produce the nutrients from Martian resources. You must extract and purify the water. You must generate the energy. You must maintain the growing environment against temperatures that would freeze or kill any plant. You must provide artificial lighting because Martian sunlight is too weak and dust storms can block it for months. All of this is possible, in principle. NASA has studied space agriculture extensively. Plants can be grown in hydroponic systems. Nutrients can be synthesized from basic chemicals. The caloric needs of a colony can, theoretically, be met through intensive greenhouse agriculture. But theory and practice are different things. Biosphere 2 attempted closed-system agriculture on Earth and nearly starved its inhabitants. The crops produced less than expected. Unexpected problems arose. The carefully designed system proved less robust than its creators believed. A Mars colony would face every challenge Biosphere 2 faced, plus challenges unique to Mars. Lower gravity affecting plant growth in ways we don't fully understand. Higher radiation damaging plants and potentially making them unsafe to eat. Martian dust contaminating growing areas with perchlorates. Equipment failures disrupting carefully maintained environmental conditions. Crop failures on Earth cause hardship. Crop failures on Mars cause death. There are no grocery stores to fall back on. No neighboring farms to buy food from. No emergency supplies except what you brought from Earth, which will eventually run out. The food security of a Mars colony would be perpetually precarious. One bad growing season, one equipment failure, one disease outbreak in the greenhouses. Any of these could kill everyone. And we haven't discussed nutrition. Humans require specific vitamins, minerals, proteins, fats. A diet of hydroponic lettuce and tomatoes will not sustain human health. You need variety. You need completeness. You need to grow dozens of different crops, each with its own requirements, each subject to its own failure modes. Or you bring food from Earth at enormous expense, in quantities sufficient to sustain the colony indefinitely, which brings us back to the economic problem. Who pays? For how long? What happens when they stop? Let me tell you about politics and governance, because these may doom colonization more surely than physics or biology. Who owns Mars? This is not a philosophical question. It is a practical question with profound implications for any colonization attempt. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 signed by every major spacefaring nation, prohibits national sovereignty over celestial bodies. No country can claim Mars or the Moon or any asteroid. No flag planted on alien soil conveys legal ownership. This was intended to prevent a colonial land rush in space, to ensure that the cosmos remained the province of all humanity rather than being divided among the powerful. Noble intentions, disastrous implications for colonization. Without sovereignty, there are no property rights. Without property rights, there are no legal protections for investments. If a company spends billions building a Mars colony, what prevents a rival company from landing next door and taking whatever they want? What prevents a hostile nation from seizing the colony entirely? Nothing under current international law. Companies need legal frameworks to operate. Investors need assurances that their investments are protected. People need laws that define their rights and responsibilities, contracts that can be enforced, courts that can adjudicate disputes. None of this exists for Mars. The legal infrastructure that makes modern civilization possible simply does not extend beyond Earth. Some have proposed modifying the Outer Space Treaty to allow property claims in space. The United States has taken small steps in this direction, passing laws that allow American companies to own resources extracted from asteroids. But resource extraction is different from territorial claims. Owning the ore you mine is not the same as owning the land you mine it from. Any meaningful property rights regime for Mars would require international consensus, which seems impossible to achieve. Why would nations that cannot afford their own space programs agree to let wealthy nations claim extraterrestrial real estate? Why would they endorse a legal framework that excludes them from the wealth of the solar system? The geopolitics of space colonization have barely been considered. We imagine colonies founded by visionary entrepreneurs or enlightened space agencies operating in a political vacuum, free from the conflicts that plague Earth. This is fantasy. Mars colonies would exist within the same international system that produces wars and sanctions and trade disputes on Earth. They would be pawns in great power, competition, targets for rivals, hostages to political fortunes. Imagine a Mars colony funded primarily by the United States. How would China view such a colony? As a peaceful scientific outpost, or as an extension of American power? A strategic asset that shifts the balance of power in America's favor? Would China feel compelled to establish its own colony, beginning a space race with colonial stakes? Imagine a colony experiencing a political crisis, a disputed election, a coup, a civil conflict. What can Earth do? Send troops? The journey takes months. By the time any intervention arrives, the situation will have resolved itself one way or another. This points to a fundamental reality that colonization advocates often ignore. A Mars colony would be, in effect, independent from the moment of its founding. The isolation that makes colonization so challenging also makes it ungovernable from Earth. The communication delay alone prevents real-time oversight. You cannot manage a crisis when every exchange of messages takes 40 minutes. You cannot enforce laws when your police are 200 million kilometers away. You cannot compel obedience when the colonists control their own life support and you have no way to reach them. Any Mars colony would be autonomous in practice, regardless of what legal arrangements exist on paper. The colonists would govern themselves because there would be no alternative. Whatever authority Earth claims would be purely theoretical, dependent entirely on the colonists' willingness to acknowledge it. This has utopian appeal for some, a chance to start fresh, to build a new society unconstrained by the mistakes of the past. Libertarians dream of Mars as a frontier beyond the reach of government. Idealists imagine enlightened communities governed by reason and consensus. Visionaries see the opportunity to correct every flaw in human civilization. History suggests otherwise. Utopian communities have a dismal track record. They tend to collapse into authoritarianism, to fracture into warring factions, to dissolve in acrimony and failure. The Pilgrims nearly starved. The French Revolution devoured its children. Communist experiments produced totalitarian nightmares. Every attempt to build a perfect society has foundered on the imperfection of human beings. Why should Mars be different? The colonists would be human. They would carry with them all the flaws, all the conflicts, all the irrationalities that have plagued our species throughout history. They would disagree about politics, about religion, about how resources should be allocated and decisions should be made. They would form factions. They would compete for power. They would sometimes hate each other. Now imagine those conflicts in an environment where everyone depends on everyone else for survival, where a malcontent can threaten not just social harmony but the air supply, where a political faction can take control of water production and hold the rest of the colony hostage, where there is nowhere to go, no escape, no possibility of simply leaving and starting over somewhere else. The potential for tyranny is obvious. Whoever controls life support controls everything. A determined minority could seize power and maintain it indefinitely because the majority has no leverage, no alternative, no way to survive outside the structures the tyrants control. We have seen this dynamic in isolated communities on Earth. Antarctic research stations have experienced psychological breakdowns, power struggles, near-violent conflicts. Submarine crews, despite careful screening and military discipline, sometimes fracture under the pressure of confinement. These are temporary assignments with known endpoints. Imagine permanent confinement with no possibility of escape. The governance challenge is not merely philosophical, it is existential. A colony that cannot govern itself effectively will not survive. Political collapse leads to operational collapse. People who cannot cooperate, cannot maintain the complex systems that keep everyone alive. A Mars colony that descends into factionalism and conflict will soon be a Mars colony that everyone dies in. How do you design governance structures for a community that is permanently isolated, permanently confined, permanently dependent on technology that any faction could sabotage? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. The problem has no precedent in human history. Let me tell you about economics, because economics underlies everything else. Colonization is expensive. The costs are almost incomprehensible. Getting a single kilogram of payload to Mars costs thousands of dollars with current technology. A minimal colony would require thousands of tons of equipment and supplies. The initial investment would be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, perhaps trillions. Who pays? Governments spend money when they perceive national interest. The Apollo program was funded because the United States was competing with the Soviet Union for global prestige. That competition ended. Space budgets collapsed. For 50 years, no government has been willing to fund anything comparable to Apollo, despite having far greater resources than the 1,960 seconds. Would governments fund Mars colonization? Perhaps, if a new space race emerges. China's growing space capabilities might motivate the United States to respond. National pride is a powerful force, but national priorities shift. Governments that fund ambitious programs can be replaced by governments that cancel them. A colonization effort spanning decades would have to survive countless election cycles, economic crises, and shifting political winds. Private funding faces different challenges. Companies invest to make profits. What profits does Mars offer? The honest answer is none, at least for the foreseeable future. Mars has no resources valuable enough to justify the cost of shipping them to Earth. The economics are prohibitive. Even if Mars were made of solid gold, the cost of transporting that gold to Earth would exceed its value. There is nothing on Mars that Earth needs badly enough to pay interplanetary shipping costs. Some suggest that Mars colonies could sell intellectual property, patents on inventions developed in the Martian environment. Perhaps. But intellectual property requires legal frameworks to protect it. Those frameworks don't exist for Mars. And even if they did, the revenue from patents seems unlikely to cover the costs of maintaining a colony. Tourism? Perhaps wealthy adventurers would pay for the experience of visiting Mars. But tourism requires the infrastructure to support tourists, which requires investment, which requires revenue, which tourism is supposed to provide. The chicken and egg problem is inescapable. The realistic economic model for Mars colonization is subsidy, permanent, indefinite subsidy from Earth. The colony produces nothing of economic value. Earth pays to keep it alive anyway, for reasons of prestige, ideology, or long-term species survival. How long would Earth be willing to pay? Through economic recessions? Through political upheavals? Through the inevitable scandals and disasters that would attend such an ambitious project? What happens when a new government decides that money would be better spent on Earth? What happens when voters decide they're tired of funding people on another planet? The colonists would be utterly dependent on the continued goodwill of people they've never met, governed by political systems they cannot influence, separated by months of travel time from anyone who might help them. Their survival would depend on continued funding that could be cut at any time, for any reason, or for no reason at all. This is not a stable foundation for a permanent human presence. It's a temporary arrangement masquerading as permanence. It's a house built on sand, waiting for the tide to come in. Let me tell you about what I call the single point of failure problem. On Earth, human civilization has tremendous redundancy. If one city is destroyed, other cities survive. If one nation collapses, other nations continue. If one crop fails, food can be imported from elsewhere. The distribution of humanity across the entire planet, in thousands of communities using hundreds of different approaches to survival, makes our species resilient against almost any conceivable catastrophe. A Mars colony would have no such redundancy. It would be one settlement, perhaps eventually a handful of settlements, all dependent on the same basic infrastructure, all vulnerable to the same failures. Consider the scenarios that could destroy an established colony. A pandemic, spreading through the confined population with no possibility of quarantine because everyone shares the same air. An engineering failure in a critical system with no redundant capability to compensate. A natural disaster, perhaps a meteor strike or a Marsquake, damaging infrastructure beyond repair. A political collapse leading to civil conflict and the destruction of essential systems. Any of these scenarios could kill everyone, not just set back the colony, but end it entirely. All the investment, all the sacrifice, all the people, gone. And because the colony is small and isolated, there would be no possibility of rescue, no way to rebuild, no second chances. On Earth, we bounce back from disasters. Cities destroyed by war are rebuilt. Populations decimated by plague recover over generations. The resilience of human civilization comes from its distribution, its diversity, its redundancy. A Mars colony would have none of this. It would be fragile in a way that no human community has been fragile since our ancestors huddled in small bands on the African savanna, one bad season away from extinction. The obvious solution is multiple colonies. Spread the risk. Establish settlements in different locations with independent systems so that the failure of one doesn't doom all. But multiple colonies multiply the costs. If one colony costs hundreds of billions, 10 colonies cost trillions, the resources required exceed anything humanity has ever mobilized for a single purpose. And even with multiple colonies, the population would still be small, still be isolated, still be vulnerable in ways that Earth-based humanity is not. The scale of colonization required for true resilience, populations in the millions, distributed across the planet with diversified infrastructure and genuine self-sufficiency, seems impossibly distant. Centuries away at best, perhaps unachievable ever. In the meantime, any colony would be a precarious outpost, perpetually at risk, depending for its survival on nothing going too badly wrong for too long. Let me tell you about time, because time is the enemy of all human projects. Colonization is not a project you complete. It's a commitment you make forever. The moment you establish a permanent human presence on another world, you obligate yourself to maintain that presence indefinitely. You cannot simply decide after a few decades that colonization was a mistake and bring everyone home. By then, there will be people born on Mars who have never known Earth, whose bodies may be incapable of surviving Earth's gravity, who have nowhere else to go. Forever is a long time. Human institutions don't last forever. They rarely last centuries. Governments rise and fall. Empires expand and collapse. Ideologies flourish and fade. The political entity that founds a Mars colony may not exist 100 years later. The economic systems that fund it may be transformed beyond recognition. The Roman Empire lasted 5 centuries and considered itself eternal. The British Empire lasted 2 centuries and believed it would never end. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years and proclaimed itself the inevitable future of humanity. All are gone. All were replaced by something unimaginable to their founders. What political and economic arrangements will exist on Earth 200 years from now? 500 years? 1,000? We cannot know. We cannot even usefully speculate. The world of 1024 AD bears almost no resemblance to the world of 2024 AD. The world of 3024 AD will be equally alien to us. Yet colonization assumes continuity. It assumes that the commitments made today will be honored by entities that don't yet exist, using systems we cannot imagine, for reasons we cannot predict. It assumes that whatever replaces current governments and economies will share our values, will care about Mars colonists, will continue to invest in their survival. This is a remarkable assumption. It may be an unwarranted assumption. The future has no obligation to honor the promises of the past. The people of 2324 may look at struggling Mars colonies and decide they have better uses for their resources. They may be right. The colonists would have no recourse. They could not compel support from Earth. They could not threaten consequences. They could only appeal to the conscience of people 300 years removed from the original colonial project, people with their own problems, their own priorities, their own understanding of what humanity owes to whom. I find this deeply troubling. We would be creating human beings, generations of them, whose very existence depends on the continued charity of Earth. We would be making promises on behalf of people not yet born, to people not yet conceived. We would be gambling with lives that are not ours to gamble with. This is not like founding a city in a remote location on Earth. People born in remote Earth cities can leave. They can walk away if conditions become intolerable. They can survive without continuous technological support if necessary. They have options. People born on Mars would have no options. They would be prisoners of circumstances they never chose, dependent on technology they cannot maintain without Earth's help, trapped on a world that will kill them the moment that technology fails. Is it ethical to create such people? To bring human beings into existence under conditions of such absolute dependency and vulnerability? I am not sure, but I believe the question deserves far more consideration than it has received. Now let me tell you why, despite everything I have said, I still believe we must try. I have spent this entire time explaining why human colonization of other planets may be impossible. The biology is wrong. The physics is punishing. The economics don't work. The politics are intractable. The timescales are incomprehensible. Every system in your body, every structure of human civilization, every assumption we make about life and society, all of it evolved for Earth and Earth alone. And yet, we are the species that left Africa when staying would have been easier. We are the species that crossed oceans in wooden boats, not knowing what lay beyond the horizon. We are the species that climbed mountains because they were there, that dove to the bottom of the sea because we wondered what we'd find, that built flying machines when every sensible person knew that humans were meant to stay on the ground. We are not sensible. We are not prudent. We are not content with what we have and where we are. This is our greatest flaw and our greatest virtue. We reach for things beyond our grasp. Sometimes we fall, sometimes we fail. Sometimes we die in the attempt. But sometimes, against all odds, we succeed. Everything I have described tonight is true. The challenges of colonization are immense. The obstacles may be insurmountable. The risks are profound and possibly unacceptable. But I have learned over a lifetime of studying the cosmos and the creatures that contemplate it to be humble about the limits of the possible. A century ago, powered flight was impossible. Humans had been trying to fly for millennia. They had built wings, jumped off towers, crashed, and died. The scientific consensus was clear. Heavier than air flight was a fantasy. The mathematics had been worked out. The energy requirements were prohibitive. Birds could fly because evolution had optimized them for millions of years. Humans could not. Then two bicycle mechanics from Ohio built a rickety wooden contraption and flew it for 12 seconds. 12 seconds, 120 feet. That was all. The flight was shorter than the wingspan of a modern airliner. The distance was less than the length of a football field. By any objective measure, it was a trivial achievement, a barely controlled hop that proved nothing about practical aviation. And yet everything changed. Within a lifetime, humans were flying across oceans, breaking the sound barrier, walking on the moon. The impossible became routine. The inconceivable became mundane. Children today grow up taking for granted capabilities that would have seemed like magic to their great-grandparents. I am not saying that colonization will follow the same trajectory. The challenges are different. The obstacles are more fundamental. Biology is harder to overcome than aerodynamics. But I am saying that human history is filled with achievements that seemed impossible until someone achieved them. The pessimists are always right until suddenly they're wrong. Let me tell you about why colonization matters. Despite all the reasons it may be impossible, we are, as far as we know, alone. In all the vast cosmos, across billions of galaxies, containing billions of stars, we have found no evidence of any other intelligence. Perhaps life is common, but intelligence is rare. Perhaps intelligence is common, but technology is rare. Perhaps technological civilizations arise frequently, but destroy themselves before they can spread beyond their home worlds. We don't know. The silence of the universe is profound and, to me, terrifying. What we do know is this. Life on Earth is precious beyond measure. 4 billion years of evolution have produced a biosphere of staggering complexity and beauty. Millions of species, each a unique solution to the problem of existence. Ecosystems of intricate interdependence. And one species, ours, that can contemplate it all, that can ask questions about its own origins, that can reach toward the stars. All of this exists on one world, one fragile, vulnerable world floating in the cosmic darkness. One asteroid impact, one supervolcano, one gamma ray burst from a nearby stellar explosion, and it could all be gone. 4 billion years of evolution. Millions of species. 8 billion human beings. The only known intelligence in the universe erased. This is not paranoid fantasy. It has happened before. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The dinosaurs who had dominated the Earth for over 100 million years were wiped out. 75% of all species went extinct. Life survived, but the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the world that had been. It will happen again. Not tomorrow, probably. Not in our lifetimes, hopefully, but eventually. The universe is not safe. It is not designed for our benefit. It operates according to laws that are indifferent to our existence. And those laws permit catastrophes that could end everything we are and everything we might become. The only way to ensure the long-term survival of life and intelligence is to spread beyond this one world, to plant seeds of consciousness on other planets, other moons, eventually other star systems, to become so distributed, so redundant, that no single catastrophe can extinguish us. This is the argument for colonization that I find most compelling. Not economics, not adventure, not national prestige, survival. the survival of everything that matters. Against this imperative, all the obstacles I have described seem less insurmountable. Yes, the biology is wrong, so we'll learn how to make it right, or we'll adapt, or we'll accept the costs. Yes, the physics is punishing, so we'll develop new technologies, new approaches, new solutions. Yes, the economics don't work, so we'll find new economic models, new sources of funding, new reasons to invest. Humans are not rational creatures who weigh costs and benefits and make optimal decisions. We are dreamers. We are strivers. We are the species that does things because they're hard, because they're meaningful, because some part of us refuses to accept limits. I don't know if colonization is possible. I have spent this entire discussion explaining why it might not be. But I know that we will try. We will try because we are human. We will try because the alternative, accepting that we are forever confined to this one world, is intolerable to something deep in our nature. Let me tell you about what I hope for. I hope that I am wrong about some of the obstacles I have described. I hope that human biology is more adaptable than we fear. I hope that children born on Mars will thrive, different from Earth-born children perhaps, but healthy and happy in their own way. I hope that the psychological challenges of isolation can be managed, that humans can find fulfillment in confined spaces, that new forms of community and meaning will emerge. I hope that technology will advance in ways we cannot predict, that closed-loop life support systems will be developed that actually work, that manufacturing capabilities will become so automated that small populations can produce everything they need, that artificial intelligence will become sophisticated enough to assist colonists in ways that compensate for their small numbers and limited expertise. I hope that human institutions will prove more durable than history suggests, that the commitments made to colonists will be honored across generations, that political and economic support will continue even through crises and upheavals, that some form of governance will emerge for Mars that avoids both tyranny and chaos. I hope that the first colonists will be extraordinary people, capable of enduring hardships we can barely imagine, solving problems we cannot anticipate, building a society under conditions that have no precedent in human history. And I hope that their descendants will be equally extraordinary, adapting to their strange home, creating a new branch of human civilization. I don't know if any of these hopes will be realized. The challenges are real, the obstacles are formidable, the reasons for pessimism are compelling, but hope is not the same as prediction. Hope is a choice, a commitment, a refusal to surrender to the apparent impossibility of a goal. Hope says, we will try, knowing we might fail, because the alternative to trying is accepting limits we find unacceptable. Let me tell you about the long view. Human civilization is approximately 10,000 years old. Writing was invented about 5,000 years ago. Science, in its modern form, is perhaps 400 years old. Powered flight is 120 years old. Space flight is 70 years old. The first human walked on another world 55 years ago. We are just beginning. We are infants taking our first steps into a universe of infinite possibility. The challenges that seem insurmountable today may seem trivial in a century. The technologies that don't exist may be commonplace in 2 centuries. The political and economic obstacles that block us now may dissolve in ways we cannot foresee. I will not live to see humanity establish a permanent presence on another world. The time scales are too long, the challenges are too great, but I believe it will happen. If not in my children's lifetimes, then in their children's or their children's children's. The dream is too powerful, the imperative is too clear, the alternative is too bleak. We will reach for the stars, because that is what we do. We will fail many times in many ways. We will learn from each failure. We will adapt, improve, try again. And eventually, against all odds, some generation of humans will succeed in creating a permanent foothold on another world. Those future humans will look back at our time as we look back at the time of the Wright brothers. They will marvel at how little we knew how primitive our technology was, how daunting the obstacles must have seemed, they will understand that we could not see the path that led to their existence, that we could only take the first steps and trust that future generations would take the rest. I take comfort in that. I take comfort in being part of a species that dreams impossible dreams and then sometimes makes them real. I take comfort in knowing that even if I never see the future I hope for, I can contribute to it. Every question asked, every problem studied, every objection raised, every obstacle identified brings us closer to solutions we cannot yet imagine. The universe is vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to our existence. It does not care whether we survive or perish. It does not care whether consciousness spreads through the cosmos or flickers out on one small world. It simply is operating according to laws that we are only beginning to understand. But we care. We care deeply, passionately, irrationally. We care enough to dream of other worlds, to plan expeditions that may not launch for decades, to argue about the details of colonies that may never exist. We care because caring is what consciousness does. It reaches toward something beyond itself. It refuses to accept that what is must always be. I have told you tonight why colonization may be impossible. I believe every word I said. The obstacles are real, the challenges are immense, the reasons for doubt are compelling. But I have also told you why we must try anyway. Because the alternative is extinction. Because we are the only known carriers of consciousness in a silent universe. Because hope is a choice, and I choose hope. The planets are waiting. Mars with its rust-red deserts and ancient river valleys, the moons of Jupiter with their hidden oceans, worlds we haven't discovered yet around stars we can barely see. They're waiting for us, patient as only dead worlds can be patient, indifferent to whether we ever come. I believe we will, not because it's easy, not because it's certain, but because we are human. And humans have always looked at the impossible and asked, what if we tried anyway? That question is the beginning of everything. Every achievement, every discovery, every expansion of what we thought possible started with someone asking, what if we tried anyway? So let us try. Let us fail. Let us learn. Let us try again. Let us keep trying until we succeed or until we are certain, truly certain, that success is impossible. And even then, let us try once more, because that is who we are. That is what we do. And that is why, despite everything I know about the challenges, despite every reason for doubt, despite the voice in my head that says this cannot be done, I still believe that one day human beings will live on other worlds. The cosmos is vast. Our time is short. Let us not waste it on despair.